First of all, civil society brings forward information. I reviewed my files on Sudan, and I can tell you, we brought information about the situation in Darfur a long time before it was in the public news. Had these early warnings been taken seriously with good information that came from civil society and our contacts in Sudan, at least we would have had a chance of preventing the worst tragedy. I say Darfur was preventable. Now, I want to also give some good news. I think we brought forward the case of East Sudan, and indeed our government did take more attention to that. And Peace Envoy Mobina Jaffer was one of the first to go to East Sudan, engage with the government of Sudan, and at least somewhat help diffuse that situation. I'm not an academic researcher, but it would be interesting to pursue it in greater detail. We believe that that action helped to prevent what could have been as bad in East Sudan as it was in Darfur. And of course, many of us are very focused on South Sudan yet. Credibility of information is important. In Canada, at one point, we sponsored our own human rights investigation into violations happening in the neighborhood of Talisman Energy. Had that report, which had all the credibility done to the highest standards of human rights investigations, had that report been given attention a number of years ago, who knows what the results could have been. Right now, we are focused on bringing forward information about the attacks that are happening right now. Again, is happening as we speak on the border of Chad, and nothing is being done. Civil society can also raise the priority of an issue. I think it's fair to say Sudan would be less of a priority in Canada without civil society activism. And I think we beat ourselves on the head because we say we never do enough, we never can keep it front line. And that's one of our challenges. We raise the profile, we get some attention. It's very hard to sustain it in this country. But I think it's fair to say that it would not be the priority it is without that civil society activism. And we do know it sort of comes up as one of the top three. So some credit there. I think one of the biggest roles we have is in bringing forward alternative analyses and alternative approaches. First one I would like to highlight over the years is highlighting that human rights are a cause of conflict, not just an unfortunate byproduct. For several years when I engaged in advocacy with our Foreign Affairs Department, it was continually, well, those human rights violations, you know, they're just a byproduct of the conflict. If we just solve the conflict, they'll disappear. And I think over time that has shifted. And the analysis is very much understanding more and more that human rights violations are contributing causes to conflict. They are not just unfortunate byproducts. Secondly was a whole of Sudan policy. When we started working on Sudan, the general impression was we should deal with the South, we should deal with Darfur, all as separate. And it was civil society who first brought to the table, this is a question of a central oppressive government against all its marginalized peoples, whether it's South, Darfur, East, North in Sudan. And I think over time, you can track in the government documents, a change did happen and it began to be approached much more as a whole of Sudan issue. I don't think we've still worked that out, because you still now see a shift of focus to Darfur. And those of us who are concerned about the peace agreement in the South not being implemented in 6 years are very worried about that shift of attention. I think we do need to look at this as a whole of Sudan issue. So how a conflict gets framed, the narrative, if you will, the storyline, I think is something that civil society can have a big impact on, and it's something that does shape the politicians' understanding and their response. And I think it's also a huge burden. Certainly at the conference we were at Uganda, I think many of us were burdened about how are we telling the story of that conflict and how is that impacting the response to that. Something for all of us to think about. The third is a different approach. I think in the case of Sudan, the civil society advocates have always argued for carrots and sticks. And I would argue that Canada and others use carrots far too long in the case of the government of Sudan. We needed diplomacy with more muscle. It's not popular to say in Ottawa, but I think our diplomats were outsmarted by the diplomats of the government of Sudan many, many times. And I could cite examples starting back with the issue of children and the conference in Winnipeg. I think, though, that civil society does have impact, and just looking internationally now, the reference to the ICC probably would not have happened without a lot of pressure from international civil society advocates. Resolution 1706, a pretty good resolution on Sudan if we could implement it. Much of the language has come from the international civil society advocacy community. So I think we can make some impact. Of course, the question is turning all of that into real action on the ground. I want to highlight one thing from the long-term agenda. If we are going to prevent genocide, then the human rights mechanisms must be strengthened. They are very weak, and they must be strengthened very early on. There are very few penalties for violating human rights at the early stages. Civil society will also need to lead and persist in that movement to get much stronger mechanisms for all parties and accountability for human rights violations. I believe the mechanisms that are being put in place to help protect children in armed conflict may be a little step forward, but we really need to have much more attention to that. I just wanted to comment on our means of advocacy. I think we try to be as strategic as possible. And here in Canada, that means sometimes, we work very closely with the department. For example, when the government of Sudan would come to town, I would be asked sometimes to come and present issues of human rights violations. It's probably easier for them to let me speak to the human rights violations, and then they can, pick up and say, well, you see, that's what, our NGOs are telling us we need to address. That's fine. I think we can do that. And certainly Lloyd Axworthy was an expert in learning how to work with civil society in foreign issues. It's more difficult when we disagree. And I think the Sudan file has also seen us in that camp. And I think our department and our politicians are probably less adept at dealing with us when we disagree. And I would say Talisman Energy was probably the strongest case, where we were often in confrontation with our own government, and perhaps we did not come up with good resolutions of that one. In that regard, I really welcome the greater interest of parliamentarians in foreign policy issues. I think that's going to make a huge difference for us in civil society. In previous governments, there was less interest, I think, on the parliamentary side. We talked more to officials and the minister. We're eager to engage with parliamentarians. Finally, civil society creates the social space and public support for tough decisions. We have run successful campaigns on Sudan. I think there is public awareness. I do believe that if the politicians wish to act more seriously on Sudan, they would find public support in Canada. And now we are moving to more of a global civil society movement. It's really a transnational advocacy network. And one of the issues that's raised about Darfur relative to Uganda is, do we have enough local voices from Darfur coming forward? So that's something for all of us to think about.